Welcome to What's Up with Catalight, a podcast designed to raise the many important voices that are helping to shape the future for people with autism and IDDs by challenging the status quo. Your host, Dr. Lindsey Sneed, dives into the thought-provoking topics happening in the industry and at Catalight, from advocacy to research to treatment options and more. Tune in to discover how Catalight's innovative treatment options are pressuring industry-wide change and shining a spotlight on care that's shaping the landscape for individuals with developmental disabilities. We join Dr. Sneed for part 2 in this 2-part series, a continuation of the last episode of What's Up with Catalight.
Thank you so much for tuning into part 2 of our podcast with Brian Middleton. We're going to continue our conversation talking about boundaries, rules, and extinction. Brian, take it away.
So at boundaries, rules, and extinction, let me create a hypothetical for you.
Okay.
The hypothetical is we have a minefield, like with explosive mines. I actually thought of this while watching the TV show MASH with my wife. The episode where the little boy runs into the minefield after his ball. Yes. And they have to use...
I saw that episode. Not only did we grow up in the same town, Brian, but we both watched MASH.
Actually, I didn't watch MASH until I was an adult. But,
oh my gosh.
But it's I'm glad I did, because there was a lot of things I would have missed as a kid. But so the little boy runs into the minefield and it's like, oh, this is bad. Like, this is very, very bad. So for those who aren't familiar, MASH takes place during the Korean War as a little South Korean boy who runs into this minefield. And it's like the MASH unit, which is, I forget exactly what MASH stands for, but it's a mobile hospital, basically. The people are trying to make sure this kid is not killed. So they solve the problem by getting a helicopter and someone hanging off of a ladder and pulling the kid out so that he's not hurt. But like the hypothetical came to me when I saw that. And it's like, okay, let's say that we have this minefield and we have this fence around the minefield because it's not been disarmed. And we have somebody who just really wants to go into that minefield. Maybe the reason they want to go into that minefield is because they got their eyes set on the horizon. They want to go that direction. Or maybe it's they were playing ball and their ball fell in there and they really care about their ball. Or maybe their pet ran into that area. And it's like, there could be ever so many reasons. And the boundary is you can't pass this line because this is dangerous. So if you try passing this line, I'm going to stop you and make sure that you're safe. But we don't just stop there. We also redirect out towards what are our other options?
Yeah.
So like if it's get to the other side, it's like, oh, well, let me show you how to get around. Right? If it's go after your ball or your pet, it's okay. If it's ball, can we get you a new ball? Like it's not worth your life, right?
Yeah.
But if it's your pet, it's like, okay, how can we save your pet? Do we get a helicopter? Do we get, do we call the pet over and hope that they don't blow up? Right? All these different things. But it's not just stop, you can't pass. It's how do we problem solve together?
Yeah.
And extinction, when it's in the context of a differential, where we're showing that there's other directions we can go and there's other things we can do, is more likely to be aligned with the rights of the individual. But if it's just no, total shutdown, more often than not, the answer is going to be that's not a good thing. Now, I will give a scenario where it was a just blanket no, we're not doing this. And that was one of the learners I was working with, probably on the edge of level 2, 3 autism. So kind of in the realm of almost profound, if you want to use that terminology.
Okay.
Like definitely higher support needs, but vocal.
Okay.
And he was going through puberty and he was noticing the characteristics of the female form.
Yeah.
And he was wanting to grab and touch.
Yeah.
And the answer was definitively 100%. That's their body. That's their right. The answer is no. And we went through an extinction burst, several. But in that particular case, he does not have the right to touch somebody without their permission.
And in that situation, too, on his to take it home further is for him, that could cause law enforcement involvement, and then a really, really scary situation where police are involved. We have somebody whose verbal skills aren't as complex as maybe the police officers. And it can be a very, very dangerous situation really quick for that individual. And now they're losing their rights too.
If any one person says this thing by default 100% of the time is never acceptable, the answer is probably without fail that they don't understand the concept. Mm-hmm. Are there exceptions to that particular rule? Probably. I don't know. But like it's going in with that curiosity and that realization that one size doesn't fit all, that we need to meet the needs of the individual and how we conceptualize them and their experiences that they're having. So,
and this does lead into my next question, which and so I'm going to be super straightforward here. I am a behavior analyst. I'm also a psychologist. And I would say my number one work is I would say I am a clinician. And my role is to support, I primarily work with autistic folks. And my role is to support the autistic person in whatever form I guess the referral question is in, right? So if it's young children and parents, it's going to look a little bit different than a youth. And then versus an adult, like there's lots of variation in there. And so with that perspective in mind, I don't come into my work thinking that applied behavior analysis, what I would call in the traditional form, which people don't love that language. So I'm hoping you and I can contextualize that a bit. And the traditional form is not effective for every single person on the spectrum. And so when I say traditional applied behavior analysis, more of what I'm thinking of is this tiered ABA, or where a paraprofessional is coming in, working with the individual. I think that behavior analysis is speaking of multifaceted, can be applied in a lot of different ways than just in that model.
Mm-hmm.
But I would love to hear from your perspective if you believe and if you have experiences where a paraprofessional delivered model of ABA maybe is limited in how it is being applied with an autistic person.
So perhaps the biggest limitation that I see happening within that quote traditional model, the early intervention model, would probably be a better way of phrasing it, is that it's rigid, because it's focused very much on the easily observable. That's a critical piece right there. The easily observable behaviors. Now,
I really like that, easily observable behaviors.
Yes. For those who are unfamiliar with behavior analysis has to do with stimulus. Everything that behavior analysis has to do with boils down to, what does stimulus do? Now, what is stimulus? Stimulus is light, it's sound, it's touch, it's sensation, it's cold, it's heat, it's like it's all these different things. Here's a fun one for you. Did you know that we don't actually have sensors in our body to detect wet?
What?
We don't detect wet, we detect cold.
Oh, that is so interesting.
So
I learned something every time we chat. I learned something new.
I'm a big old behavior nerd, and I love all things behavior, like anything behavior, animal behavior, human behavior, it doesn't matter. But we don't have wet sensors. We have cold sensors. So if the temperature of the water is perfectly matched to the temperature of the environment around, all we will sense is pressure when we insert our hand into the water. And if you pull your hand out and the temperature maintains, you don't detect what we call wet. It's not wetness. Okay. It's just a temperature shift. But that's stimulus. That's all has to do with stimulus. And stimulus applies to all living organisms, all things that are capable of detecting stimulus. So there are behavior analysts who work with plants.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there are behavior analysts who work with animals and humans. And there's even behavior analysts who are working with AI.
Oh, yes, I did know that.
Yep.
Yes.
So like we're pushing the bounds of what constitutes living, because something can detect stimulus. Is that living? And my favorite slightly morbid thing that goes around the behavior analysis community is something called, and it's not exclusive to behavior analysis, by the way, but it's called the dead man test.
Yeah.
And so the dead man test is, if a dead man can do it, it does not count as behavior. So laying down is not a behavior, but the act of getting down to lay down is a behavior. Falling over is not a behavior, but tumbling, which is where you move your body in a certain way to allow for you to roll in a certain way, that does count as behavior. Sleep counts as a behavior because a dead person can't sleep.
Yeah.
And so when we're going into and understanding stimulus and how stimulus matters, behavior analysis, due to the easily accessible sources for funding with early intervention, has unfortunately been typecast into early intervention because we're looking at easily observed and described stimulus. So the answer is, if that's the model and the approach, to bring it back around, I know I kind of got off in the weeds again. I'm good at that.
No, but I really liked, this was really good, Brian. I really appreciate this.
But like, so when we're talking about that model, if we're not flexible enough to do that little bit extra work of identifying stimulus that's maybe a little bit more difficult to understand and explore, then the answer is no, that model is not going to work.
Yeah.
But if we're able to do that work, if we're willing to dive a little bit deeper, if we're willing to do work in multidisciplinary teams, and one of my favorite observations I like to point out is speech language professionals, they're behavior analysts who focus on language acquisition. And occupational therapists, they're behavior analysts who focus on sensory and understanding sensory. And what is sensory but how one engages with stimulus?
Yeah.
Right. And physical therapists, they're behaviorists or behavior analysts or behavior scientists, if you will, who specialize in how the body moves. Right. And if we stop narrowing and start expanding, like the same thing goes with how we treat our learners, how we support them. But we also, as professionals, need to do the same thing as well. Like maybe, so this is speaking specifically to the behavior analysts in the audience. Maybe the way that the other person is describing is not the way that you would describe it, but you're a behavior analyst, you're a behavior scientist. So your job is to ask questions and try to figure out what they're saying within the behavior analytic framework. That we too often get stuck on the mentalism thing of, well, that's mentalism. Well, yeah, but they're describing as something.
Yes.
So how do we get past that? Because when we say that's mentalism and we move on, we engaged in mentalism. We engaged in a thought terminating tact, is what I would call that.
Explain that.
So tacting in behavior analysis means to label. So tact, interact, to basically label something. So thought terminating is something I'm adding as a modifier. It's maybe a language terminating if you really want to, or verbal behavior terminating if you want to be super behavior analytic. But the idea is that you label something that you observe, and then because the explanation is circular in its nature, well, that's mentalism, so therefore I don't have to engage with it. That terminates the thought, and you end engagement. Yep. And that's dangerous.
Speaking more to like behavior analytic in a behavior analytic way, it's I like that thought terminating tact. And also when you think about function of behavior, it is a avoidance maintained function, because you no longer have to engage in that potentially difficult conversation.
Response effort. Yeah.
Yeah. So you're engaging in a behavior, thought terminating tact. So it's getting you out of having to engage in a discourse that, may or may not be comfortable for you.
Well, and then there's also a social attention maintained component, right? Because you're engaging in the same verbal community.
Yes.
And so therefore it's easy to say that sort of thing, and you get that confirmation of the group.
Yeah.
And then there's also an access piece, because, if you're avoiding something, you're also accessing something. And then there's also that sensory automatic piece of, oh yes, I know my things. Yes. and then that kind of that feel good sensation of,
Yes.
yeah. Oh yes. I said the thing. I did the thing that was supposed to be done.
Yes. Yes. Are you familiar, Brian, with any emerging approaches for providing services to autistic folks or people with IDD that are showing promise?
So one of the approaches that I have some experience in, and I'm specializing in. I say specializing because I am not 100% at mastery for this. I'm learning and I'm growing and I'm expanding in my knowledge set. But that is something called the enhanced choice model.
Okay.
And then the enhanced choice model is an expansion on, or a continuation on, the PFA SBT model. PFA stands for Practical Functional Assessment. SBT stands for Skills-Based Training. For those who aren't familiar with that term or that community, it's My Way is another, or Greg Hanley. So PFA SBT is, if we were to look at this kind of from a multi-tiered systems of support, kind of the school model of tier 1, tier 2, tier 3.
Yes.
So PFA SBT would be kind of a tier 2. Like, we're dealing with, they call it severe problem behavior.
Okay.
I prefer costly behaviors again, but whatever. So that'd be kind of a tier 2, and tier 3 would be enhanced choice, which is an expansion on that. And enhanced choices and PFA SBT both are focusing on something that they don't really, as far as I know, use this a lot in the community, but it's basically replicating or in some kind of halfway acknowledging the work that neurology has done when it comes to strain or demand on the neurological system. And the polyvagal theory, for those who are not familiar with it, is there's, I'm going to be referencing it a little bit, but basically the polyvagal, poly meaning many, vagal meaning the vagus nerve or different places.
Oh, got it. Okay. Yeah.
And so the polyvagal theory, kind of broken down, is if you look at the side of a head, you'll see there's the forebrain, which is up top, and there's the middle brain, and then there's the base of the brain. And if it, again, this is a rough analogy, there's more to it than this, but basically forebrain is verbal behavior, midbrain is emotional reasoning, and then base brain is kind of that lizard brain, that fight flight component. So if we were to break it down, it's like fawn and freeze are midbrain, and fight flight's base of the brain. And it's understanding that, like, when we're talking about complex behaviors where there's that are very costly, that we can't just look at it just from an operational behavior analytic perspective. We also need to look at it from a respondent perspective. It's a respondent behavior. Think Pavlov, if that name rings a bell.
Pavlov's dog.
Yep, the Pavlov's dog, right? And so this is an oversimplification. There's more to it than this, but basically Pavlovian or respondent behavior has to do with survival.
Yes.
Right? Again, it's an oversimplification, but it has to do with survival. And when we're seeing somebody who's in that survival mode, my words, somebody else might have said it too, so I don't really care who uses it. The biggest thing is, like, when somebody's in survival mode, trying to get them to learn is not easy. And even then, can you really constitute it as learning? And in fact, I'm going to bring in that example of extinction, because this actually is really good object lesson here. So when behavior analysts are taught about operant extinction, the examples that are used are a vending machine that doesn't put the food out, like it gets stuck, or you're knocking on a door or ringing a doorbell, right? And those are all non-survival situations. We can turn them into survival situations if you're in a slasher movie and you're trying to get into a house, right?
Yeah.
Or you're starving. But like, I don't want to confuse terms. So let's go ahead and leave those where they're at.
Okay.
And let me place operant extinction in the form of planned ignoring.
Mm-hmm.
Operant extinction doesn't have to be planned ignoring. It's planned ignoring falls underneath operant extinction. So let's say that we have the reinforcer in question being air. Air, as in one's ability to breathe.
Oh, air. Okay.
Air, yeah.
Yes.
So so the person is out in the middle of a lake or a body of water, and they're drowning, and they're flailing, and they're cursing, and they're making all these different things, and we're over there on the shoreline or in a boat, and we're saying, "Use your words, then I'll throw you the rope." Like, it's ridiculous. You laugh because it's ridiculous, but at the same time, it's just like when somebody is in survival mode,
yes,
and we're engaging in operant extinction, you're using an operant procedure or an operant principle for respondent behavior.
Yeah.
That's where trauma happens.
Yes, we have to help calm down first.
Like you get them out of the water.
Yes.
Now, having being a Eagle Scout and having been through multiple trainings where I've actually had to rescue people in mock drowning incidents. Thankfully, never had to do it in person. Like, yes, the flailing can be a problem, right? And so one of the things that you do have to do in that particular circumstance is you have to move the person and kind of hold them in a way so that way you're not being pulled under as well.
Yeah.
So the situation, the metaphor is perfect because that's what in those circumstances, sometimes it's not as easy as just throwing somebody a rope. It's sometimes you have to go in there with them. But at the same time, if we're applying the operant behavior framework, the learning through consequences framework to a person who is in survival mode, and just because we can't see it doesn't mean that it's not happening.
Yeah.
And that's where polyvagal theory comes in, is understanding that part of the brain might be activated. And this might seem innocuous to you, but to the other person, it's not. And this is where the PDA, the pathological demand avoidance community comes in, and the stuff that they've been doing. And I don't like the term PDA for pathological demand avoidance. I prefer persistent drive for autonomy.
Okay.
Right? Because we're framing, we're not framing from a narrowing, we're framing from an expanding perspective. Yeah. Somebody's driving for autonomy. Demands constitute a threat to their autonomy. Okay. Yeah. So one, we meet them where they're at, but we don't stop there. We also help them reconnect, recondition, repair, right? Whatever term you want to use, that a demand doesn't necessarily mean you're under threat. Mm-hmm. But before we can do that, if the person is experiencing a lot of overwhelm, if they're experiencing a lot of pushing of themselves to the limits, then like if you had a cold and you got up on the wrong side of the bed and your neck hurt and maybe, it was just a really bad day in combination, I would meet you where you're at. Like, I would look at what's going on and be like, hey, what's on your plate?
Yep.
How can I take that off your plate? And yet a lot of times we expect people to be little machines and show up and behave this exact same way every single day, when the reality is that we're multifaceted, complex beings.
Yeah.
There's a lot going on. And we need to be able to afford each other that humanity.
Yeah. I want to add to this a little bit from a different emerging care model, if you will. So I think one thing, I really like what you were saying about applying the early intervention model, and we're looking at the easily observable behavior. And I think what's happened in a manner is people have applied that early intervention model to people across the lifespan, thinking it's going to be as effective, and it's not. In some context, absolutely. I'm not saying throw the baby out with the bathwater. There are some times when it is. And I would say that's probably more the rarity, the exception than the rule, if you will. But what we're seeing, of course, is we have autistic youth and adults who who are seeking out services, who want to work on things usually around executive functioning, planning, relationships, finding a romantic partner, getting a job, things like that, and are having trouble navigating that part of the world. And so at Catalight, we developed this program called Compass Behavioral, or Compass B. And it's a manualized behavioral program that focuses on those areas of executive functioning and social relationships. So we're applying behavioral intervention into a manualized model where we're using what you called last week, Brian, like more verbal behavior approaches to engage with the individual. And the thing that I'm really excited about with this model is, so we're training behavior analysts in the model. So it feels a bit different for a behavior analyst and how we would typically deliver care. We're working directly with the individual. We're using a manual where it feels a bit different. And so there's an additional training component that has to happen. But the thing I want to share is how successful it's been for not only the behavior analysts who are being reinforced by watching the progress of the program, but for our autistic youth and adults who are engaged in the program, who are benefiting so much from like this short-term model of care. And the thing that we're seeing is not only improvement in their specific skill sets that they want to focus on, but we're seeing improvement in well-being. So Catalight had developed these well-being scales because we couldn't find a well-being scale that really specifically met the needs of the population that we serve. So we developed well-being scales. Our family well-being scale was recently published in JAD. And then these are the autistic youth and adults in the program take a youth well-being scale or adult well-being scale. And our short-term results are demonstrating improved well-being, where the thing that the individual wants to work on is improving. The person is feeling like greater quality of life. So we're able to adapt a behavioral program to really fit the individualized needs of the person. But we have like gone way over time. And there's one more question I really want to ask you, Brian. So when Brian and I first started chatting a few weeks ago, we found out that we grew up in the same town. Not only did we grow up in the same town, we grew up in the same town at the same time because we're practically the same exact age. And the thing that we were both experiencing in meeting is how each of us looked so familiar because honestly, we grew up in such a small Northern California town that we probably have met in a previous portion of our life. So my question for you, Brian, is there anything from that town that you miss, that you wish you could take with you in Utah?
I miss the smell of the Ponderosa pines.
Yours is such a better answer than mine. I love the mountains. Anytime I can go up to the mountains, I want to be there. It's really a safe and happy place for me. In downtown Placerville, there was this coffee shop, and I cannot remember the name of it for the life of me. I want to say maybe it was called Gelatos or something like that, which I was like, maybe not, because maybe they just served gelato. But they had this espresso drink that was made with mint ice cream.
Oh.
And it's called like a grasshopper, but it closed down a number of years ago. But man, I loved going to that coffee shop, and I would go there after classes at the Folsom College, the Placerville campus at the Folsom College, and drink coffee. So I wish that was still around and with me now.
Yeah, I that sounds wonderful. That sounds wonderful. I've got such wonderful memories of that area, and like one thing that I regularly have people say to me, and I love it when they say this because then I can offer them perspective. So they're like, well, you're high functioning autistic or you're low support needs autistic. And my response is, no, I'm autistic and I need my community. And I was privileged. I was lucky enough to grow up in a community where there were resources that other people didn't have. And one of those resources was the El Dorado County Library had this fascinating little thing that was way ahead of its time. Like nowadays, it's easy for this to happen, but back then it was not. The Thomas Kincaid audiobook library.
Yes.
And so Thomas Kincaid lived and worked in Placerville. And it was, I found out about this afterwards because as a kid, all I cared about is I want to get those tape cassettes. I want to listen to those audiobooks. And the library just had all of just this massive collection of across so many different genres. And it got its start from Thomas Kincaid, who was a painter and who would paint all these beautiful landscape scenes. He would have a glass of booze in one hand and his paintbrush in the other, and he would listen to books. And as soon as he was done with them, he'd go and donate them to the library. And
Wow.
the library then started like raising funds and building this audiobook library. I didn't break the code on reading until I was 11 or 12.
Yeah.
I struggled really hard with reading, but I was hyperlexic in the form of verbal. But I was not hyperlexic. I still have a reading disability. I'm dyslexic dysgraphic. So it's still a challenge, but like that little piece right there expanded my world. And I had access to those resources, and there were other resources I had access to. And a lot of times when I see people judging people based off of function, I just go, okay, but how can we expand their world?
Yeah. Yeah.
And then we let them follow the reinforcement that matters to me. And that's what happened to me.
Yeah. I love it. Well, Brian, thank you so much for your time today. I so appreciate our conversation and just all the amazing work that you're doing. And I'm sure we will chat and see each other again soon.
Okie doke. Thank you.
Thanks, Brian.
This has been What's Up with Catalight, hosted by Dr. Lindsey Sneed. Now you know what's up with Catalight.